Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you ready for a bedtime story? Well, tonight's story is called Alexander and the Windup Mouse by Leo Lionni. As you listen, can you tell me why Alexander would want to be a wind-up mouse? Help! Help! A mouse! There was a scream, then a crash. Cups, saucers, and spoons were flying in all directions. Alexander ran for his hole as fast as his little legs would carry him. All Alexander wanted was a few crumbs, and yet every time they saw him, they would scream for help or chase him with a broom. One day, when there was no one in the house, Alexander heard a squeak in Annie's room. He sneaked in, and what did he see? Another mouse, but not an ordinary mouse like himself. Instead of legs, it had 2 wheels, and on its back there was a key. "Who are you?" asked Alexander. "I'm Willie the Wind-Up Mouse, Annie's favourite toy. They wind me to make me run around in circles. They cuddle me at night. I sleep on a soft white pillow between the doll and the woolly teddy bear. Everybody loves me." "They don't care much for me," said Alexander sadly, but he was happy to have found a friend. "Let's go in the kitchen and look for some crumbs," he said. "Oh, I can't," said Willie. "I can only move when they wind me." "But don't mind, everybody loves me." Alexander, too, came to love Willie. He went to visit him whenever he could. He told him of his adventures with the brooms, flying saucers, and mouse-traps. Willie talked about the penguin and the woolly bear, and mostly about Annie. The 2 friends spent many happy hours together. But when he was alone in the dark of his hideout, Alexander thought of Willie with envy. "Oh," he sighed, "why can't I be a wind-up mouse like Willie and be cuddled and loved?" One day, Willie told a strange story. "I've heard," he whispered mysteriously, "that in the garden, at the end of the pebble path, close to the blackberry bush, there lives a magic lizard who can change one animal into another." "Do you mean," said Alexander, "that he could change me into a wind-up mouse like you?" That very afternoon, Alexander went into the garden and ran to the end of the path. "Lizard, lizard," he whispered, and suddenly there stood before him, full of colours of flowers and butterflies, a large lizard. "Is it true that you can change me to a wind-up mouse?" asked Alexander in a quivering voice. "When the moon is round," said the lizard, "bring me a purple pebble." For days and days, Alexander searched the garden for a purple pebble. In vain. He found yellow pebbles, and blue pebbles, and green pebbles, but not a tiny purple pebble. At last, tired and hungry, he returned to the house. In a corner of the pantry, he saw a box full of old toys, and there, between the blocks and the broken dolls, was Willie. "What happened?" said Alexander, surprised. Willie told him a sad story. It had been Annie's birthday. There had been a party, and everyone had brought a gift. "The next day," Willie sighed, "many of the old toys were dumped in this box. We will all be thrown away." Alexander was almost in tears. Poor, poor Willie, he thought. But then suddenly something caught his eye. Could it really be? Yes, it was. It was a little purple pebble. All excited, he ran to the garden, the precious pebble tight in his arms. There was a full moon. Out of breath, Alexander stopped near the blackberry bush. "Lizard, lizard in the bush," he called quite quietly. The leaves rustled, and there stood the lizard. "The moon is round, the pebble is found," said the lizard. "Who or what do you wish to be?" "I want to be—" Alexander stopped. Then suddenly he said, "Lizard, lizard, could you change Willie into a mouse like me?" The lizard blinked. There was a blinding light, and then all was quiet. The purple pebble was gone. Alexander ran back to the house as fast as he could. The box was there, but alas, it was empty. "Too late," he thought, and with a heavy heart he went into his hole in the skirting board. Something squeaked. Cautiously, Alexander moved closer to the hole. There was a mouse inside. "Who are you?" said Alexander, a little frightened. "My name is Willie," said the mouse. "Willie!" cried Alexander. The lizard did it." He hugged Willie, and then they ran into the garden path, and there they danced until dawn. The end. So, you know why Alexander wanted to be a wind-up mouse? But he didn't become one, did he? He helped the wind-up mouse become a real mouse. Good night. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you ready for a bedtime story? Well, tonight's story is called Frederick by Leo Lionni. As you listen, can you tell me how Frederick surprises his family in the cold, dark depths of winter? Once upon a time, all along the meadow where the cows grazed and the horses ran, there was an old stone wall. And in that wall, not far from the barn and the granary, a chatty family of field mice had their home. But the farmers had moved away. The barn was abandoned, and the granary stood empty. And since winter was not far off, the little mice began to gather corn and nuts, and wheat and straw. They all worked day and night, all except Frederick. "Frederick, why don't you work?" they asked. "I do work," said Frederick. "I gather the sun rays for the cold, dark winter days." And when they saw Frederick sitting there, staring at the meadow, they said, "And now, Frederick?" "I gather colours," answered Frederick simply, "for the winter is grey." And once Frederick seemed half asleep. "Are you dreaming, Frederick?" they asked reproachfully. But Frederick said, "Oh no, I'm gathering words, for the winter days are long and many, and we'll run out of things to say." The winter days came, and when the first snow fell, the 5 little field mice took to their hideout in the stones. In the beginning, there was lots to eat, and the mice told stories of foolish foxes and silly cats. They were a happy family. But little by little, they had nibbled up most of the nuts and berries. The straw was gone, and the corn was only a memory. It was cold in the wall, and no one felt like chatting. Then they remembered what Frederick had said about the sun rays and colours and words. "What about your supplies, Frederick?" they asked. "Close your eyes," said Frederick, as he climbed onto a big stone. "Now I send you the rays of the sun. Do you feel how their golden glow?" And as Frederick spoke of the sun, the 4 little mice began to feel warmer. Was it Frederick's voice? Was it magic? "And how about the colours, Frederick?" they asked anxiously. "Close your eyes again," Frederick said, and when he told them of the blue periwinkles and the red poppies in the yellow wheat and the green leaves of the berry bush, they saw the colours as clearly as if they had been painted in their minds. "And the words, Frederick?" Frederick cleared his throat, waited a moment, and then, as if from a stage, he said, "Who scatters snowflakes? Who melts the ice? Who spoils the weather? Who makes it nice? Who grows the four-leaf clovers in June? Who dims the daylight? Who lights the moon? 4 little field mice who live in the sky, 4 little field mice like you and I. One is the spring mouse who turns on the showers. Then comes the summer who paints in the flowers. The fall mouse is next with walnuts and wheat, and winter is last with little cold feet. Aren't we lucky the seasons are 4? Think of a year with one less, or one more." When Frederick had finished, they all applauded. "But Frederick," they said, "you are a poet." Frederick blushed, took a bow, and said shyly, "I know it." The end. So now you know how Frederick surprised his family in that little cold stone wall during the winter. Good night. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you ready for a bedtime story? Well, tonight's story is called Matthew's Dream by Leo Lionni. As you listen, I want you to work out how the visit to the museum helped Matthew see his surroundings in a new light. Once upon a time, a couple of mice lived in a dusty attic with their only child. His name was Matthew. In one corner of the attic, draped with cobwebs, were piles of newspapers, books and magazines, an old broken lamp, and the sad remains of a doll. That was Matthew's corner. The mice were very poor, but they had high hopes for Matthew. He would grow up to be a doctor. Perhaps then they would have parmesan cheese for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But when they asked Matthew what he wanted to be, he said, "I don't know. I want to see the world." One day, Matthew and his classmates were taken to the museum. It was the first time. They were amazed at what they saw. There was a huge portrait of King Mouse IV, dressed like a general, and next to it was a picture of cheese that made Matthew drool. There were winged mice that floated through the air, and mice with horns and bushy tails, and mountains and rushing streams, and branches bowing in the wind. The world is all here, thought Matthew. Entranced, Matthew wandered from room to room, gazing at the paintings. There were some that he didn't understand at first. One looked like the crusts of pastry, but when he looked more carefully, a mouse emerged. Then, turning the corner, Matthew found himself face to face with another little mouse. She smiled at him. "I'm Nicoletta," she said. "Aren't these paintings wonderful?" That night, Matthew had a strange dream. He dreamed that he and Nicoletta were walking hand in hand in an immense, fantastic painting. As they walked, playful patches of colour shifted under their feet, and all around them suns and moons moved gently to the sound of distant music. Matthew had never been so happy. He embraced Nicoletta. "Let's stay here forever," he whispered. Matthew woke with a start. He was alone. Nicoletta had faded with his dreams. The grey dreariness of his attic corner appeared to him in all its bleak misery. Tears came to his eyes. But then, as if by magic, what Matthew saw began to change. The shapes hugged each other, and the pale colours of the messy junk heap brightened. Even the crumpled newspaper now looked soft and smooth, and from afar Matthew thought he heard the notes of a familiar music. He ran to his parents' corner. "I know," he said, "I know. I want to be a painter." Matthew became a painter. He worked hard and painted large canvases filled with the shapes of colours of joy. Then he married Nicoletta. In time he became famous, and mice from all over the world came to see and buy his paintings. His largest painting now hangs in the museum. When asked about the title, Matthew smiles. "The title?" he says, as if he never thought about it before. "My Dream." The end. So now you know how a visit to a museum can help you see the world in a different way, and even help you to find your dream. Good night. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you ready for a bedtime story? Tonight's story is called Fish is Fish by Leo Lionni. Before you listen, I want you to think about what would happen if a tadpole made friends with a minnow. Once upon a time, at the edge of the woods, there was a pond, and there a minnow and a tadpole swam among the weeds. They were inseparable friends. One morning, the tadpole discovered that during the night he had grown 2 little legs. "Look at this," he said triumphantly. "Look, I'm a frog." "Nonsense," said the minnow. "How could you be a frog if only last night you were a little fish, just like me?" They argued and argued until finally the tadpole said, "Frogs are frogs and fish are fish, and that's that." In the weeks that followed, the tadpole grew tiny front legs and his tail got smaller and smaller. And then, one fine day, a real frog now, he climbed out of the water and on to the grassy bank. The minnow too had grown and had become a full-fledged fish. He often wondered where his 4-footed friend had gone, but days and weeks went by and the frog did not return. Then one day, with a happy splash that shook the weeds, the frog jumped into the pond. "Where have you been?" asked the fish excitedly. "I have been around the world, hopping here and there," said the frog, "and I have seen extraordinary things." "Like what?" asked the fish. "Birds," said the frog mysteriously. "Birds." And he told the fish about the birds who had wings and 2 legs and many, many colours. As the frog talked, his friend saw the birds fly through his mind like large feathered fish. "What else?" asked the fish impatiently. "Cows," said the frog. "Cows. They have 4 legs, horns, eat grass, and carry pink bags of milk." "And people," said the frog. "Men, women, children." And he talked until it was dark in the pond. But the picture in the fish's mind was full of lights and colours and marvellous things, and he couldn't sleep. Ah, if he only could jump about like his friend and see that wonderful world. And so the days went by. The frog had gone, and the fish just lay there, dreaming about the birds in flight, grazing cows, and those strange animals all dressed up, that his friend called people. One day, he finally decided that come what may, he too must see them. And so with a mighty whack of the tail, he jumped clear out of the water and onto the bank. He landed in the dry, warm grass, and there he lay, gasping for air, unable to breathe or move. "Help!" he groaned feebly. Luckily, the frog, who had been hunting butterflies nearby, saw him and with all his strength pushed him back into the pond. Still stunned, the fish floated about for an instant. Then he breathed deeply, letting in the clean, cool water run through his gills. Now he felt weightless again, and with an ever so slight motion of the tail he could move to and fro, up and down as before. The sun rays reached down within the weeds and gently shifted patches of luminous colours. This world was surely the most beautiful of all worlds. He smiled at his friend the frog, who sat watching him from a lily leaf. "You were right," he said. "Fish is fish." The end.